Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of Wonk Week. My name is Rebecca Rethwish, and I'm a Customer Success Manager at Quorum. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join the call, and then we'll get started.
Can you see that, Rebecca?
Yes.
Great. I can't see you, though.
Yeah, my video is on, so we should be good. Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead and get started. Once again, my name's Rebecca, and we're here to discuss applying data-driven insights to public affairs strategy. Before we dive in, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, this session will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be distributed after the event. Second, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a chat box and a Q&A submission form. We encourage you all to use the chat throughout the session to share insights and submit your questions to Q&A as you think of them. And then we'll go through the questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, we're ready to dive into the content. I'm really excited to be joined here today by Jonathan Scharf, Director of Insights at Subject Matter Pivot. Jonathan specializes in policy and data-driven public affairs, campaign development, and geopolitical risk insights. He has been recognized by Insider New Jersey as a top 100 policymaker in New Jersey. Prior to joining Subject Matter Pivot, Jonathan worked at the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce and in the policy division at the New York City Council. Today, Jonathan will show us how to uncover actionable, data-driven insights by leveraging media monitoring tools. Then he'll share some real-life use cases that your organization can replicate to build a more effective public affairs strategy. Thank you for joining us today, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. I enjoy participating in these each year. There are a lot of really impressive people presenting, so certainly appreciate being a part of this great group. And Rebecca, I'm kind of flying in the dark a little bit. I see my screen, but I don't see you or the chat or anything. So just feel free to shout out if you need anything or need me to if there's anything worth flagging. So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm the Director of Insights for Subject Matter Pivot, and Subject Matter Pivot's the name is a result of our two firms merging together, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But my focus on the insights team is working with clients that really have a multi-state operating presence. They need to keep track of the policy, regulatory, stakeholder landscapes impacting their operations and expansions. And so, as you can imagine, Quorum provides a lot of value in giving us some visibility into that multi-state environment. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is through the public affairs lens, which really means for us, helping our clients, whether that be companies, advocacy organizations, other clients, helping them have a strategy to engage with stakeholders. And that could be elected officials, advocacy groups, media, local communities, a whole large spectrum of different stakeholders. And so getting into what we're going to talk about today, I want to share a little bit about, who I am, what we do at Subject Matter Pivot, how we use Quorum. There are some commonly answered questions that we just are always using Quorum for. And it's generally these three questions here. So we're going to kind of go through those. We're going to talk about how those three questions kind of are the foundation for, deeper analysis, which has, implications for strategic planning and public affairs campaigns. And then I'm going to share some client use cases that we use Quorum for monitoring, custom data, and to do risk analysis. And we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. And so, excuse me. So this slide here, it just really wanted to reiterate subject matter and Kivit were once two firms, now we're one together. The thing that I like to emphasize is the combination of creative advocacy and data-driven strategic communications. The two fit really well hand in hand to provide a pretty comprehensive approach. Quorum fits really well into that. So just wanted to kind of reiterate subject matter Kivit, and eventually we'll have a new name as one firm, perhaps early next year. And so I put this slide up here not to like show you all the things that we do and all that, but really, to show the role that Quorum plays throughout our capabilities, especially during research and strategy development phases when we're thinking about, client challenges. How are we looking at the landscape that they're operating in? How are we making recommendations as to different tactics and strategies? How are we putting campaigns into motion and measuring their effectiveness and kind of seeing the different change out there around their initiatives? And so when you look at kind of the four big things that we do on this analyze side in the upper left here, Quorum plays a big role in, and you'll notice I put kind of like the little Q for Quorum next to all the things that it can provide some input into. And so in that analyze quadrant, from an insights perspective, we're doing a lot of landscape analysis, right? That's kind of the context in which companies are operating in. We're looking at elected officials. Maybe we're doing like scoring in terms of their support for a particular policy initiative or client initiative. We're doing policy analysis. We're measuring kind of the consumption of ideas and policy amongst elected officials, which we can do through mentions and Quorum. On the advise side, we're dissecting policy issues, understanding how they're being talked about amongst elected officials. If the volume of mentions or conversation about a certain topic amongst elected officials is really large and voluminous, perhaps we're advising on how the client could become part of that conversation in a unique way, right? Because we can fully see kind of that conversation that's out there and the way that elected officials are talking about it. Or if there's very limited conversation about a very niche policy topic or something really new, right? Perhaps there's an opportunity to implement a different strategy where, there's more of an opportunity to shape and own that narrative through strategies that educate policymakers. And then on the engage kind of side of things here, getting visibility into stakeholders, right? How those stakeholders are relevant and resonate with elected officials. So important because, in a lot of campaign strategy that we do, having credible third-party validators is really important, right? And so we want to be able to identify who those third-party validators are and those stakeholder organizations so we can integrate that into the public affairs campaign strategy. So little Q kind of is pretty prominent throughout a lot of what we do. So Quorum plays a big role in that. So what are elected officials talking about? And so, there was a lot kind of in the intro there, but I want to ultimately simplify things here. In this next section, we're going to look at some of these common questions that we answer with Quorum. And the first one is, what are elected officials talking about? And, every kind of user, should probably know that, through the document search, elected official mentions, right? Looking at their owned channels, right? Their constituent communications, their social media profiles, right? Those are all data points that kind of help answer this question, right? What are elected officials talking about? So to start, we're going to use, a fun example, a simple fun example, right? And when you do research into mentions by elected officials, you have to make sure that it makes sense by geography and context. So we're using kind of sports here to prove that point, right? There's no surprise, right, that the most popular sports in America are the most popular things that sports that elected officials talk about, right? We see, soccer, football, baseball, all being talked about in the most populous states, right? California, Texas, Florida. And then we know that hockey, my favorite sport's more regional, right? Talked about in the northern part of the country. But again, right, thinking about geography and context, this all makes sense, right? It's all good. But there's another thing we can pay attention to, which is outliers, right? And that's if let's say hockey's starting to be talked about in Arizona, and you see that in the data, and you're like, whoa, what's going on there, right? Like that might be something worth investigating, right? And then you see kind of the top states where this conversation is taking place amongst these elected officials. Right, we already noted the correlation to the most populous states, right? And there's other kind of contextual factors sort of driving, why the conversation might be occurring about these sports in these different states, whether that be, the World Cup or, political elections that had former, football players involved. All these things are kind of the context around the conversation. So just every mentions kind of research opportunity, sort of think about geography, context to kind of validate, but also if there are outliers to explore further. So the next slide here is more of a client example, right? So we're looking at mentions, we're looking at answering the question, what are electeds talking about? And ultimately mentions are barometers for elected official engagement. With the caveat, right, we already talked about checking the context, right, in the geography, but the caveat that as of right now, this chart that I'm showing you is, sentiment agnostic, right? It's just simply mentions. But, if you were to dig deeper into these issues, right, that the majority of the conversation is not, all positive or all negative. There's different elements driving each of these things, right? So again, kind of, it's not too much of a surprise that if you think about what electeds are talking about offshore wind, that there are states, on the coast, primarily in the Northeast, right? There's been a lot of news around offshore wind recently in New Jersey, right? That all makes sense. When you think about natural gas, we know that there are some states that, it's the industry heavy states, Texas and Pennsylvania are on there. But then in California, there are some local communities that are actually banning natural gas in new construction. So there's definitely a sentiment kind of breakdown required to really get a sense of, how is this issue being talked about? Right. And then the outliers point too, right? And you could look at nuclear energy and say, any of these states might warrant further investigation, just based upon, who's showing up in the conversation. So moving on here. What media outlets are relevant? So clients ask this question all the time, right? What media outlets are relevant? And what it really means is what media outlets can we engage from an earned or paid media perspective so that elected officials will see our message. And we kind of approach this in sort of two different ways. For electeds that are inside of the DC Beltway, right, we have our own media habits survey, dedicated entirely to answering this question. And basically it says, here are the platforms that elected officials are consuming their information on, and what are the outlets that they're paying attention to. But when you start to get into state-specific media outlets, this is where we use Quorum to kind of help fill that gap, right? 50 states, many different, at least, one of these types of outlets in every state, if not many more. So to kind of focus this for a second here, right? On the left, what we did was just basically put top media outlets into search and found out what elected officials are retweeting those outlets the most, right? And at the surface level, right, it's not really a surprise that like New York Times and The Hill and Fox are kind of at the top. But when you dig deeper into this, you start to understand, okay, maybe an elected official likes a particular policy topic from that outlet. Maybe they like a particular reporter from that outlet. Maybe they're quoted in the article and they're sharing it. So you kind of start to dig deeper and realize, perhaps there's an affinity between a particular elected official and a particular media outlet. And then also to kind of answer the question about, how can we guide media engagement strategies or advertising strategies? We could look at, kind of like the reach, right? So I have some examples here on the right from some research that we've previously done. North Carolina Policy Watch was retweeted 84 times amongst North Carolina elected officials, and the lead reporter there was retweeted 103 times, right? That's a pretty, influential, a data point that points to something pretty influential, right? So our recommendation to our client would be, if you want to reach, elected officials that are engaging with this outlet, maybe you advertise in this outlet, maybe you do an op-ed in this outlet, maybe you think about a way to engage that gets your message across, through this outlet. And there's other examples here for California and Florida as well. But the overall point, right, is that once you start to understand what elected officials are paying attention to, it can guide, your earned and paid media strategy. So as we mentioned, a key part of public affairs is understanding the influence of stakeholder groups. And so for this example here, I included 3 different environmentally focused groups. And so with our key questions here, we can very similar to our approach with media, right? Curated list of stakeholder groups, put it into search. A lot of these groups give out kind of like scorecards for elected official voting records. They're pursuing their own policies, in various states. But if we start to look at, okay, elected officials retweeting content from these stakeholder groups, or even directly mentioning them, or having them come in for, some type of legislative hearing, right? Those are all kind of indications as to, how influential are groups with elected officials. And then if you dig deeper, perhaps you see, the elected official is thanking them for recognizing their environmental record, or they're pursuing a policy as an elected official in alignment with this organization. Or you can see different types, maybe there's just like an event that they're at together, and they mention each other, right? These are all kind of indicators of influence and relevance, right? Which is very useful to kind of take into account when designing public affairs strategies, right? So the ultimate point here is that mentions, is a really powerful way to understand different stakeholder groups. And so this slide here kind of really brings together what I had been talking about on the previous couple of slides. And so we started with that key question each time, right? And, started to get to making the point that the data kind of is the baseline, but then some additional analysis is usually needed, right? And then that can lead to, what I'm calling a strategic imperative for, a public affairs campaign. So for example, the question, right, what electeds are talking about, we made the point, with the different energy types, that it's important to understand sentiment. And there's a couple different ways to do that, but reviewing kind of the results and scoring them, positive, neutral, negative, that's a great way to kind of get there and assign sentiment. And then once you do that, it opens up other lanes of, okay, what kind of messages are being said, in the positive or negative? Do we need to think about how that integrates into our message testing strategy, right? Perhaps the client's doing a poll or a focus group, right? And this is important context that you need to put into the different messages that we want to test, especially, in consideration of the different audiences that you want to talk to, right? The messages that you're going to have for Republican audiences are different than the messages that you're going to have for Democrat audiences. And so all of this kind of starting with that key question pulls through to the strategy and the recommendation of, okay, let's do some message testing and develop our messaging further so that it resonates with the audience that we're using that messaging for. The what media outlets are relevant question always comes down to let's look further at the content and the coverage, right? How does that content and coverage resonate with elected officials? How can we turn that content, those insights about content and coverage, into media engagement and advertising strategy? excuse me, knowing that, specific outlets are going to have the attention of elected officials, and, getting the message in front of them. That's one way of getting the message in front of them. And then the stakeholder groups, question which ones are getting attention, right? That can then lead to further analysis around messaging and positioning, right? Maybe if it's a corporate initiative, or if it's an advocacy initiative, how you position that, versus the other stakeholder groups, in alignment or against your issue. It's important, right? And that can even go a step further to say, okay, well, the recommendation here is we need to monitor a group of stakeholders for what they're doing, or we need to think through, how do we engage a certain stakeholder groups and perhaps make them third-party validators, or educate them about what we're trying to do, because we think it's in alignment with their goals and initiatives as well. So this chart kind of nicely sums up sort of like these key questions, how they're the beginning data points, what additional analysis is needed to really get to the point where you're thinking through the specific kind of public affairs strategies that it informs within the client initiatives that you have. So I'm going to get into some use cases, which are particular examples that we use Quorum on some of our different client initiatives. I'm just going to take a drink of water real quick. So the first case here is we're using custom data. And so this client has facilities all over the country. They handle medical waste, and so they have different facilities to kind of address that. And the idea here was that we wanted to take the company's facilities and put them into Quorum, use custom data, and map them to the legislators that represent those facilities, right? Always being aware of, what legislators represent your facilities at all levels of government, critically important, right? As a first step, like just even knowing their name, right? Sometimes, just the fact that Quorum can do that so quickly, that's really helpful. Then the second thing is, okay, well, where do they stand on certain policy issues? How do they, how do they view, our company in their district, right? Or are there things that they're pursuing where we could be potential partners? Or are there things that we're pursuing that we need to be aware about and could potentially be harmful? And so the particular lens that we did this exercise with is environmental justice, right? And our client has made a very big commitment to environmental justice. And they want to know simply, who's talking about it, and how are they emphasizing it? How are they talking about it? These are all elected officials that represent their facilities. And, ultimately it's definitely important that if, the company has, an emphasis on environmental justice, and the legislators that represent their facilities have this emphasis, it makes sense ultimately to figure out, a strategy around that. And so what we did was, these are all the legislators that discuss environmental justice by count. And then you can see we went forward and did that sentiment analysis. So all the legislators that are just basically white and unlabeled, right, in the chart, they're all in support of environmental justice, right? They're emphasizing it, they're talking about it, they're explaining why it's important, they're explaining, why different communities, deserve to be considered, and the historical kind of legacy that, has been created around environmental justice issues. There are some legislators that, don't really acknowledge environmental justice, or don't, prioritize it as a policy issue. So it's important to know who those are as well. Right. But the whole idea here is, now that we know this landscape of, company facilities, who the elected officials are that represent those facilities, what those elected officials' stances are on a key kind of priority of the company, then there's, further opportunities to think through, how do we do outreach? How do we do collaboration? How do we kind of partner on different things that, we both care about? So this was the basis for that type of strategy. The next use case here has to do with monitoring. And so one of our clients, a national retailer, obviously very broadly impacted by single-use plastics. One of their products that they're very concerned about fall, specifically within single-use plastics. And so what we do for them is using Quorum, we set up, 50 state, federal, state, and local monitoring for mentions of their product. And we've been doing this for a couple of years now, but I have the 2023 metrics up here, and we're evaluating, we've already evaluated over 14,000 mentions, right? And then that's translated into us tracking 88 different legislative and local proposals. And then we went in coordination, our role kind of as, Kivit is to do the monitoring aspect of it. And then there's a very close collaboration that we have with the lobbying team. And so in partnership with the lobbying team, we have this tracker where we kind of divide the different pieces of legislation into categories, right? And so, a tier one kind of engagement is usually around, a state or a locality trying to ban this type of product, right? So that, obviously gets all of our attention and resources right away. A second tier kind of restricting the use of the product. That's more of like, well, maybe we should build some relationships and, make sure it doesn't turn into a ban. Tier three is kind of, indicators of a restriction or ban potentially happening. Tier four, right, opportunities for relationship building. So there's different ways that we've categorized, the different pieces of legislation and how to engage depending on kind of where they fall within the spectrum of possibilities that, states and local governments have expressed kind of concern about the issue. And so that kind of creates our engagement model, right? So where we're doing the monitoring, after that, we're doing a risk assessment of, is this legislation, helpful or harmful to the product? We're doing that in coordination with the lobbying team. And then, the next step to that really is, how do we engage on the ground? And, when you're kind of doing this at the national level or the 50 state level, you're not going to have relationships in every single state, right? You don't want to look like the outsider kind of company coming in and, telling, a small little community on the coast of California that, the product shouldn't be banned. And so what we do is usually partner with like state retailer and state grocer associations. They're kind of the on the ground sort of local perspective that adds credibility to the effort. We coordinate with them on like what the overall strategic approach should be, and then use that to have those kind of in-state, or very local conversations about what's happening there. And so, this whole engagement model from start to finish really originates with the Quorum monitoring, and then is a collaboration along the way to get to, very specific local conversations. And this model has kind of been working for us, throughout the course of the year, but it all starts with Quorum. And then lastly here, risk analysis, this is something we do with a lot of different clients, but, again, kind of clients that have this multi-state operating environment. They need to keep track of everything that's happening, elected officials for or against, certain types of policies, the stakeholder groups, for or against, different types of in things that our clients trying to accomplish, the policy environment, right, constantly changing. And so the example here on the left, we'll go through and we'll kind of, this is for an energy infrastructure project. And we'll go through and kind of score, the different elected officials that represent these different areas. And we'll look, are they pro-economic development? Is there kind of a jobs or economic development opportunity, in the messaging to kind of talk about this project that they might, want to support it? Or, conversely, are there things that have happened in that community that are, really important to be conscious of? From, all this kind of falls broadly within infrastructure, right? But, these local issues are very important to be aware of when kind of thinking through, how would a community or those community leaders react to a proposed energy project in their community, right? Whether it be, a clean energy project or elsewise, it's that kind of analysis always needs to be done. And then from there, you kind of build out, this list of elected officials, and where, there may be kind of opportunities to collaborate or, you know, um, opportunities to kind of think through, maybe there's a different way or a different place to kind of do the project. On the right here, this map shows environmental justice data. And, that's, a big part of what we do as it relates to, throughout, many states have environmental justice maps. There's a kind of a federal environmental justice map. What we did here was we took the quorum data of mentions about environmental justice, and we paired that with data from the Department of Energy about and the energy project queue to connect into the grid, right? And so there's like this huge backlog of energy projects that want to connect into the grid, right? And you kind of pair those two things together and you start to see, okay, in places where environmental justice is talked about a lot, right, where they have concerns about, the legacy issues of a community, how a community's been, disproportionately impacted in the past by, infrastructure or corporate projects, and where some of these energy projects are planned, you start to see, can layer this into, creating like a hotspot map of areas where, if you're a developer of an energy project, you have to be, really thoughtful about how you engage the community and, how can you be, a trusted and reputable company going into a place like that. So there are a lot of dynamics that this kind of highlights, but in both of these instances, really it's the quorum mentions data, right? All the data about elected officials, the legislation they sponsor, kind of their different positions on different topics and policy issues that kind of guide and underpin this. So ultimately it's very valuable kind of as the basis of what we do. So I'm just going to get into some key takeaways here. So as I mentioned, quorum is kind of one part of our integrated stack of analytics tools, right? But it plays an important role, in many aspects of our public affairs strategy development. When you're looking at mentions, just the simple count of mentions, right? An elected official mentioning an issue 35 times, right? That's just the beginning, right? So we need to evaluate those mentions for geography, for context, for sentiment, before we can move on to the next phase, right? Of how does that actually integrate into, a data-driven public affairs strategy or, a tactic or further research that we want to do. And then, of course, along the way, when you're looking at that mentions data, outliers are always, interesting, right? When it sort of just maybe doesn't make sense by geography or for context. Those are always interesting to look into because you might see some unique kind of issues happening, at the local or state level that you otherwise may not see. The third bullet here, there are specific media outlets, right, that are better at reaching elected officials than others. Quorum helps you answer that question, right? Specifically at, the state by state level, right? There's some version of, Politica or, state specific kind of outlets for elected officials, and understanding how those resonate with elected officials can help you evaluate earned and paid media opportunities. And then identifying elected officials and stakeholder groups is just the beginning, right, to a more integrated approach, whether you're kind of layering over monitoring, right, and paying very close attention to what those elected officials are talking about, whether you're doing almost like a risk analysis where you're trying to think through, where a project or an initiative may or may not be a best fit, in terms of geography and political environment. If you're looking at, different stakeholder groups to partner with. And then also, you could always think through corporate strategies like CSR partnerships too from those stakeholder groups as well. So just wanted to give you a sense overall here of how quorum plays a role and some of the more common questions that we answer and how those kind of layer into the more specific and customized public affairs strategies that we put together for clients. So thank you.
Thanks so much. With that, we now have time to take questions. So please keep submitting them and we'll get through as many as we can. So I'm going to start with you mentioned collaborating with local voices and organizations. Do you have any advice for fostering those relationships? My organization operates nationally, but we don't have existing relationships in a lot of states.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just from the perspective of using quorum, right, you can start to identify, who those groups may be, right? Whether it be, trying to understand, let's say, there's certain groups that, you're doing your desktop research, you understand a couple groups that, are aligned or kind of relevant to your national focus group. And then maybe you want to see, are there elected officials that they partner with or, have engagement with, right? And I would say, while quorum's not specifically going to tell you, right, like the elected or the stakeholder groups that, are most relevant to your issue, you can almost kind of test them, right? And see, let's say you have a list, in a specific state and you want to know, where do I best spend my resources to reach out to these groups? Well, run the 10 names through quorum and see, what engagement they have with elected officials. And if that's an overall alignment with, your organization's goals and initiatives. So, maybe at the end of the day, it helps you kind of prioritize that outreach.
Thanks, Jonathan. Our next question, say I've identified an outlet for a potential op-ed. Any tips for actually getting something published?
So, the answer to that question is kind of where, insights and sort of my function of, identifying these outlets based upon, their content and coverage, then I sort of hand that off to somebody that's, a specialist in, earned media and, may have relationships with those reporters or that outlet, right? So essentially, from the insights perspective and kind of the context of this presentation, sort of identifying those outlets, which, is certainly a task on its own, right? And then the next level, and I kind of have the luxury of being able to pass that off to, somebody that is, a media specialist, and they're able to say, they're able to kind of do the pitch, right? And sort of get the issue in front of, that reporter or that outlet and kind of take the conversation from there. So, kind of having somebody that can kind of do that for you, or attempting to do that, is sort of like the next step of the identification.
Thanks, Jonathan. Another question, how have you seen mentions volume changed with changes to X?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something our digital team is constantly evaluating, right? Like what platforms are the best for reaching certain types of audiences. And what they're telling me and what we've seen is that on X/Twitter, there is still a significant amount of conversation that happens there amongst elected officials and stakeholder groups and media, around policy. And the quorum kind of gets you started with that, kind of look. After that, if you think about, as I mentioned, kind of like quorum's one part of our tools, you could start to see, like what articles are being shared and like how are those articles resonating throughout the platforms, and what's the engagement like on, different things that are almost like the topic of the day, right? So, the changes to Twitter/X, I don't think have significantly impacted, right, the people that want to go out there from a policymaker, stakeholder, media perspective and have those conversations. Those are all still happening out there, and we'll continue to kind of monitor and observe them, for as long as we think it's fruitful to do so. But I'll also say too, a lot of our research, I mentioned the media habits survey. We're starting to see a lot of policymakers go to LinkedIn for information, right? And LinkedIn kind of just being a more credible, kind of transparent, professional platform. You could kind of escape the some of the back and forth and the vitriol that's on Twitter, and get a little more straightforward. However, there's kind of very limited tools that have visibility into LinkedIn right now, so it's we kind of have to work with where we have the best data access to.
Thanks, Jonathan. And with that, we're coming up on the end of our time. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. And thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your expertise. Jonathan, do you have any closing thoughts?
Nothing that I had prepared. Just I appreciate being a part of this. Every year it's grown and been a great thing to tune into and watch. So excited to kind of continue to see that growth for Wonk Week, and happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn or send me an email or anything like that too.
Oh, and it looks like we have one more question.
Sure.
Speaking of X, are you monitoring Threads or any other Twitter alternative?
Yeah, so the way to kind of answer that question comes down to the level of access that those platforms give for us to be able to do so. Facebook is always going to kind of be like very community oriented, right? And there are groups on Facebook that are closed, so you don't necessarily have visibility into those. But if you're looking to kind of understand like local conversations, Facebook will always sort of be a good go-to for that. One of my colleagues on the insights team had a chart about the adoption of Threads, and it was sort of like a huge aggressive start, and then it kind of dropped off after that. But theoretically, right, if a lot of the users on Twitter eventually go over to Threads, there'll be a demand to kind of have visibility into that data and those conversations. We're starting to get more kind of visibility into TikTok, which there's a lot of kind of advocacy happening on that platform as well. So that'll be an important place to have visibility into in the future, even right now. So it's a constantly kind of shifting, evolving, and changing landscape as it relates to what kind of conversations and data are we actually able to get and observe from those platforms.
Thanks, Jonathan. And with that, the final session of this year's Wonk Week is coming up at the top of the hour. Stay on this page to learn about 2024's down ballot races, and you build your state and local election strategy with Raul Alvilar, Executive Vice President of Resolute. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.